Buckley should be viewed as someone who succeeded, just as the conservative movement he built succeeded, in winning the battles that were most important to him during the 20th century. And when conservatives in the 21st century say, "What has Buckleyite conservatism ever conserved?" they are taking for granted the achievements that they have inherited. And there are two big questions about William F. Buckley Jr. and his legacy in the 21st century. This season marks the 100th anniversary of the birth of William F. Buckley Jr. He was born on November 24, 1925, and he's arguably the man who is the founder of the post-war conservative movement. Not only the founding editor of National Review, but in fact the founder, or one of the founders, of the organization that's responsible for this very podcast. Bill Buckley in 1953 became the first president of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, which in fact back then was called the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists. ISI subsequently became the publisher of Modern Age, and Modern Age, the magazine, became the progenitor of this podcast, Modern Age with Dan McCarthy. Now, William F. Buckley Jr. is, even today, a figure that is looked upon with a great deal of reverence, but also a certain amount of criticism, not only coming from the left, but even from certain segments of the right. And there are two big questions about William F. Buckley Jr. and his legacy in the 21st century. One of these is often asked by young conservatives, and that is, what did this older generation, what did a figure like William F. Buckley Jr., who was born a century ago, succeed in conserving? What did Buckley set out to conserve? Was he successful in conserving it? And what does it mean for the 21st century? The other question that is very much on the minds, especially right now, of many conservatives, and not just conservatives, but many people who watch the controversies that the conservative movement sometimes gets itself involved in, is what William F. Buckley Jr. would say about some of today's questions involving Tucker Carlson and the limits of expression, the limits of questioning America's foreign policy, the limits of questioning America's relationship with Israel, and some of the darker questions that then emerge with, more marginal figures that involve anti-Semitism and any number of very ugly strains which sometimes infect the right. William F. Buckley Jr. dealt with these kinds of problems during his own lifetime, and he acquired a reputation which is seen in different ways by different conservatives today, a reputation of being an enforcer of orthodoxies and limits or of guardrails on the American right. Now, from one side, it could be said that William F. Buckley Jr. was responsible for keeping the kooks out of the conservative movement, and therefore saving the integrity of the movement from its very earliest days on through until the end of Buckley's career. On the flip side, some of the people who were banished by William F. Buckley Jr. or felt as if they had been pushed out of the movement by him say that Buckley was in fact the king of conservative cancel culture, and that he is responsible for a narrowing of perspectives on the right, ultimately leading to a number of follies in the early 21st century. So Buckley was not simply someone who kicked out the conspiracy-minded folks. He was not simply someone who kicked out the John Birch Society, or tried to kick out the John Birch Society, or who went after anti-Semites. Bill Buckley was also instrumental in making decisions within the conservative movement about, for example, what its foreign policy would be not only during the Cold War, but to some extent towards the end of his life after the Cold War as well. And he had a number of conflicts with some who took a more libertarian, strict non-interventionist view of foreign policy, and with conservatives like Pat Buchanan, who were not only controversial for their remarks concerning Israel, but also who had a very different vision of American foreign policy. And yet one of the ironies here is that William F. Buckley Jr. himself, who again was born in 1925, as a very young man, was in fact an America firster. He was someone who was against U.S. intervention in the Second World War. Now, the story of exactly how Buckley came to form these views, they were very much also the views of his father, William F. Buckley Sr., who was a Texas oilman, who was very much against getting America involved in foreign conflicts. The story of William F. Buckley Jr.'s formation when it came to his early views on foreign policy is very well told in a new biography of Buckley published earlier this year by Sam Tannenhouse. This, in fact, is the authorized biography of William F. Buckley Jr., and it's one that conservatives have given a mixed reception to, because Tannenhouse is not himself a conservative. Many of the tangents he goes into in the book are things that conservatives find either irrelevant to the life of Buckley or that put Buckley in a bad light. But I think the best part of the book are the opening chapters that talk about Buckley's family life, the Buckley clan as a whole, including his father and his brothers and his sisters, and also the way in which Buckley's early views views were formed. And there's an interesting narrative to be drawn out about how Buckley changes his views on foreign policy, not only over the course of World War II, but even more so at the beginning of the Cold War. So Buckley, like many American conservatives before 1941, believed that America should generally stay out of foreign conflicts, including European foreign conflicts. America had had a very bitter experience during the First World War. We came into the war fairly late. We were able to bail out our allies, to bail out England and others, and yet the consequences of the First World War were to create a situation in Europe and indeed elsewhere in the world that set the stage for another world war, for the Second World War. Meanwhile, America had incurred enormous costs to be involved in World War I. We had lost the lives of many of our soldiers, and even though we didn't lose nearly as many casualties as the Europeans did, a lot of Americans came out of the experience of World War I saying this was something we would never want to do again. And now here was another world war, the Second World War. And the question was, how should America respond to it? And especially by mid-1941, you have a situation where Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union are at war with one another. And at this point, many conservatives said, well, we certainly don't want to be allied with the Soviet Union, even if that meant that would be able to, reinforce the Soviet war against Nazi Germany. So the hope was that perhaps Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union would cancel one another out, destroy one another, and then leave Europe free. And conservatives were very repulsed by the idea of being allies with communist, Russia, with the Soviet Union. Anyway, Buckley was very much skeptical of foreign intervention in World War II. And even when he was, went and served in the military himself, as all young men did during World War II, he was still seen as being someone who was quite outspoken in having these principles which nowadays might be described adversely or in a hostile way as being isolationist. So Buckley was something of an isolationist or a non-interventionist early on in his public life. Now, the question of the Soviet role in the world becomes the determining factor in this great change in Bill Buckley's outlook. Conservatives were against foreign intervention, but they were also very much against communism, very much against the Soviet Union. And at the end of the Second World War, the Soviet Union is the great winner. The Soviet Union has control of half of Europe. You have communist forces that are supported by the Soviets continuing to gain ground in East Asia. And it's pretty clear even then that, China, which is having a civil war between nationalists and communists, may ultimately fall to the communists. And in fact, that is what happens. So the Soviet Union and communism as a whole are starting to gain an enormous amount of power at the end of World War II, and it looks like they're not going to stop. It looks like they're going to continue. The Soviets are trying to reorient the politics of Central Europe. They are active in Greece after World War II, and in fact, even in the late years of World War II. They're active in promoting communist groups in Western Europe as well, including in France. Now think about this. Europe, including Western Europe, has been devastated by World War II. These are conditions in which the Soviets are trying to maximize discontent. They're trying to go to veterans who may be starving, who might take up arms again and overthrow free governments and create a communist regime. They're going to people who are absolutely desperate for any kind of relief they can get. And the Soviets are saying, you know what would really help you in this circumstance? Communism. We're going to come in and create a revolution which is going to overtake Western Europe as well as Central Europe and Eastern Europe. So conservatives are very concerned about the sweep of communist ideology and communist power at the end of the Second World War. And conservatives start to adopt a very strong anti-communist line, which goes beyond simply keeping America itself free from the influence of communism. It extends to saying that America should support anti-communist efforts abroad. It should support efforts to check the spread of communism in Asia as well as in Europe. So conservatives, as Cold Warriors, come to be very much engaged in the international scene. Now, interestingly enough, there are some parallels where certain American liberals have an argument among themselves as well. So among liberals, the question is whether the Soviet Union is ultimately a benign thing, whether it's, maybe it's perhaps a little rough under Stalin, but it will ultimately moderate itself and become a much more liberal kind of socialist communist state, or whether, in fact, liberals themselves, American liberals, should also be anti-communist. Now, at the time, Franklin Roosevelt's administration is riddled with communist sympathizers. Franklin Roosevelt's Democratic Party is a party which is very much susceptible to being compromised by the Soviet Union and compromised by communism. One of the important things that William F. Buckley is going to do by creating a conservative movement in the post-Cold War era, an anti-communist conservative movement, is that he's actually going to influence not only the American right, but also the American left. And the effect of Bill Buckley's work, the creation of National Review and his books and everything else, will be in part to help reorient the Democratic Party, to help reorient American liberalism away from a relatively pro-Soviet view to one that is much more anti-Soviet and much more, against communism. So Buckley is very influential, ultimately, not only on his own side, but also by the provocations he creates. He forces American liberals to re-examine their own consciences and to re-examine their own team and to recognize the mistakes that had been made during the Roosevelt administration. Now, in the post-World War II era, William F. Buckley is certainly very concerned about communism and about the Soviet Union and about the Cold War, but he's also very much incensed by the spread of a, not communist, but certainly a statist, a big government mentality at home, by the growth of an ideology in support of the New Deal, by the apparently permanently entrenched New Deal welfare state, and in some ways it's a corporatist state. It's a state where what has been created by Franklin Roosevelt with the New Deal is a big government that favors certain big industries, and it's very bad for more independent, smaller businesses and, for businessmen like William F. Buckley Jr.'s father, Buckley Sr. So William F. Buckley Jr. is very much critical of not only communism abroad, but also statism at home, the New Deal in particular, and the growth of a socialistic ideology or an ideology of liberal statism. And he finds, as a student at Yale, Buckley encounters professors who are generally favorable towards a interventionist, statist version of liberal economics under John Maynard Keynes as the great economist who is promoting that view. And he finds that there are many professors at Yale who are also either sympathetic to socialism or who are simply very critical of Western civilization itself, in particular Christianity's contributions to civilization. So Buckley writes his first book, God and Man at Yale, in 1951, which is an account of his time at Yale and other controversies that are happening at Yale, showing basically how Yale has abandoned its roots as a Christian university and has adopted instead not just a secularism, but a very militant kind of secularism that is often mocking Christianity in the classroom. And at the same time, Yale has moved away from an appreciation of free market economy and the American economic system, and instead seems to be in favor of a kind of revolutionary change here at home in America in favor of a more centralized, more planned statist economy. And you even find that there are certain professors at Yale who may be sympathetic to socialism and communism. Communism, perhaps not overtly, but whose version of leftism and whose version of socialism or democratic socialism is nonetheless very soft on both communism as a theory and also the practice that one sees, communism in reality in the Soviet Union. So if you've enjoyed Modern Age with Dan McCarthy, please do hit the like button and share this podcast with all of your friends and, for that matter, with open-minded enemies or with anyone who might benefit from understanding conservatism and the roots of the conservative movement better. You can also, of course, read Modern Age both in print and online. Our website is www.modernagejournal.com. Now, at the very same time that Buckley writes God and Man at Yale and then publishes it in 1951, an older journalist by the name of Frank Chodorov is also looking at the American educational system and is seeing that socialism is on the rise. In fact, a generation earlier, in the 1920s, there had been the rise of a number of student organizations called the Intercollegiate Socialist Societies, ISS. And these were vectors of introducing stronger socialist thought and organizing on American college campuses even before World War II. And Frank Chodorov, as a journalist, as a very libertarian journalist, someone who's devoted to free markets, he writes an essay which actually undergoes a series of changes. It's an essay which he publishes in his own periodical called Analysis. He later on rewrites different versions of it which appear in Human Events and in a few other venues. He turns it into a pamphlet. This essay goes under a couple of different names. At one point it's called For Our Children's Children. At another point it's called A 50-Year Plan. And at yet another point, it has other titles as well. But the basic thrust, at one point, by the way, it's called the Adam Smith Clubs, which is another moniker that this essay has at one point. Chodorov's idea, and it's just an idea. He's a journalist. He's writing about, concepts. He's writing about the war of ideas. He's not thinking in terms of activism and organization. But he writes this essay in the early 1950s, right around the time Buckley is working on God and Man at Yale, where Chodorov says it's not nearly enough to complain about the presence of socialists on America's campuses. It's not nearly enough to say that we should get communism or Keynesianism or any form of statism and socialism out of the classroom. You need an alternative to that. The more important thing, says Chodorov, is not simply to go after these vectors of socialist and statist thinking, but instead to actually teach Western civilization, to actually teach the foundations of freedom, both morally, economically, politically, and otherwise. So Chodorov writes this essay saying what you really need are something like the intercollegiate socialist societies, only to have them be in favor of Western civilization and in favor of liberty and free markets. And he says if you had a student organization like that, that would help to counteract the influence of socialism and statism on America's college campuses. Now, Chodorov, as I say, is a journalist. He's a writer. He's not a practical man. He's not thinking about actually trying to create these institutions. He's simply saying this is what you would need if you actually wanted to do some good and not just complain about things that you don't like. Well, as it turns out, a number of people who read Chodorov's essay wind up being inspired by it, and they start sending him checks in the mail unsolicited, including J. Howard Pugh, one of the wealthiest men in America. He sends Chodorov a check for $1,000, which may not seem like much in the 21st century, but in the early 1950s, $1,000 is a lot of money. And Chodorov doesn't know what to do with it. He goes to the business manager of Human Events, one of the magazines that has published this essay, and Chodorov says, what should I do with these checks that I'm getting? And the business manager of the magazine says, never send back money. So if your readers are inspired to send you these checks, if they think that this project needs not only to be talked about, but actually carried into practice, then, Frank, you have a duty, a responsibility to try to make this happen. And Chodorov takes that seriously. So he begins working to create what becomes known as the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists. Now, who will Frank Chodorov choose as the first president of ISI? Well, who else would be a logical candidate than the person who has just been working on God and Man at Yale and who is renowned as an advocate, as a young man, of both free markets and of the roots of Western civilization, including and especially the religious roots of Western civilization. By the way, I should stop and note that one of the important things about Bill Buckley as a post-war conservative, he is one of the first, in fact, arguably the first, really prominent Catholic American conservative. So before this, you have various intellectuals you can point to as notable American conservatives. Generally, they come from, a Protestant background, although in many cases, actually, by the 1920s and 1930s, people who are prominent conservatives have actually lost touch with any kind of religious commitments and are quite secularized themselves. Buckley is very significant because he's Catholic, which is something that's unusual, and also, especially in that era, there weren't that many Catholics at Yale University. Buckley was a cradle Catholic. He was very, very, very faithful to the faith, and he was very influential in proselytizing or influencing the conversion of many of his friends and even some of his teachers at Yale University. So Buckley's best friend, Brent Bozell, also becomes Catholic, based partly on the example that Bill Buckley sets. So does the great professor who is a teacher to both Bozell and Buckley, Wilmore Kendall, who is notable as one of the very few Yale faculty who is anti-communist and is supportive of Senator Joe McCarthy's so-called red hunting and going after communist influence. Wilmore Kendall, whose own father, in fact, was a Protestant minister, and Kendall had become much more secular over time, but Kendall decides to convert to Catholicism, in part thanks to the example and the evangelizing that William F. Buckley conducts. So Buckley is very important as a touchstone in the growth of Catholic conservative intellectual influence in America. And I think that's something that sometimes gets overlooked. Buckley's personal devotion to the faith is noted very often. but Buckley's importance as a public Catholic, someone who is a Catholic and yet is aligned with Protestants who are also in favor of free markets and traditional American liberties. Buckley is a revolutionary and compelling figure here, because at this point in the mid-20th century, there is still a lot of anti-Catholic bigotry in America, and there are a lot of militant Protestants who say that, well, if you're a Catholic in America, you're not really a loyal citizen, you have dual loyalties. Catholics are really loyal to the Pope, they're not loyal to the U.S. Constitution, and that they may subvert American liberties if they get political power. Bill Buckley was a refutation of that. He was an absolutely devout Catholic who was also clearly devoted to America's traditions of liberty and indeed to the free market. Now, some conservatives, even at the time, criticized him for this. So a writer by the name of Peter Viereck, who had published a book in 1949 called Conservatism Revisited, Viereck said that there was a tension in Bill Buckley's thought between his Catholicism on the one hand, which was, Catholicism is a faith with its own social teaching, which in some cases is critical of capitalism. Viereck said there was a tension between that side of Buckley and his devotion to pure free market economics, even perhaps libertarian economics on the other hand. Now, Buckley was very much, as I say, in the tradition of his own father. So Will Buckley, William F. Buckley Sr., similarly was a devout Catholic who also was, he was a practicing capitalist. He was a, Texas oilman who also was devoted to the free market as a system, as a set of ideas, and was very much opposed to socialism and the New Deal. So Buckley is a path-breaking figure. And keep in mind, he is young. So there was an earlier generation of conservatives, but by the 1950s, many of them are middle-aged or above. In fact, some of them are so old that they're dying off. And Bill Buckley is seen as a figure who represents a renewal for American conservatism. He has changed a few things about it. It's no longer non-interventionist. Now it is willing to commit to the Cold War. Buckley is a major player in making that change. But Buckley is also seen as a figure of continuity in terms of his devotion to free markets. The American right before Buckley was very libertarian, very much free market, and very, very much anti-New Deal. Buckley represents continuity in all those regards. So Buckley is picked as, the first president of the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists. And Buckley and Chodorov set up this organization, but really the man who is most important in making ISI a success early on, and basically who becomes the heart and soul of ISI for decades, is a field representative of the organization named E. Victor Milioni. Now, Victor Milioni, like Buckley, is Roman Catholic. Milioni is certainly in favor of American, free markets and America's traditions of liberty, but Milioni is very much a traditionalist conservative. He is not a libertarian. And so there is this interesting kind of paradox where the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists, and back in 1951, Buckley himself is calling himself an individualist, not a conservative. And if you read God and Man at Yale, which again was published in 51, Buckley refers to himself throughout that book as an individualist. It's individualism that he's on the side of, again, because individualism is the opposite of communism, and it's the opposite of socialism and statism. So those are the things that Buckley is affirming then, and that's what the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists is affirming. But of course, individualism can mean many different things. And the question is, what is the root of our freedoms? What is the root of everything that we want to preserve about the free market economy? Property rights, for example. Well, Victor Milioni is much more sensitive to the idea that we have to defend the cultural and civilizational roots of the West, and we have to defend Christianity, and of course Milioni himself is Catholic. So all of these elements come to lend weight to a traditionalist side of ISI. Even though it remains called the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists for a decade or so, really it has become a strongly traditionalist conservative institution. It has a lot of libertarian friends. It hosts libertarian speakers on campuses, but really the center of gravity at ISI from the beginning is very much traditionalist. And Buckley, of course, is not an opponent of any of that. Buckley is someone who represents an attempt to bring together both libertarianism, especially in economics, and traditionalism and religion, especially his own Catholic faith, and to integrate all these things together. And one of Buckley's colleagues at National Review, which is the magazine that Buckley founds in 1955, a man by the name of Frank Meyer, rather. Frank Meyer tries to systematize and think through how you could have a consistent philosophy that is both libertarian and traditionalist, or rather, a consistent philosophy which Frank Meyer says, has always been the philosophy of the West and has always been the philosophy of Western conservatism, but that sometimes has deviations either in the direction of libertarianism or an ultra-traditionalism that is critical of free markets. So this is the bringing together of the elements that cohere into the early 20th century, mid-20th century conservative movement. Buckley goes on from ISI. He resigns after about a year of being president. Victor Milioni will ultimately become, the president and the guiding force of ISI. Bill Buckley goes on a couple of years later to found a new conservative magazine in 1955 called National Review. And it's also celebrating an anniversary this year because it's founded in 55 and, in November of 55, in fact. So it's very much also something that's celebrating its birthday right now. National Review is really dedicated by Buckley to 2 or 3 specific missions. And when conservatives in the 21st century say, what has Buckleyite conservatism ever conserved? They are taking for granted the achievements that they have inherited. And so it's one of the paradoxes of history. If you win the battles you set out to win, your descendants may say, hey, you didn't contribute anything because you weren't fighting today's battles. Buckley was not fighting the battles of the 21st century. The battles he was fighting instead were to prevent the spread of Soviet communism, to, not only that, but also to roll back and ultimately defeat Soviet communism. He was also fighting against not just the New Deal, but the trajectory of ever more statism in America. The New Deal was certainly seen by progressives, by the left, as being a beginning, not an end. So you go from the New Deal in the 1930s to the Great Society under Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s. And progressives would have liked to continue that. They would have liked to continue building, a second, a third, a fourth, an infinite number of ever greater New Deals and ever more state control of the American economy, ever new forms of, socialization of healthcare and other things. And so this is what Buckley is trying to prevent. He's trying to stop the metastasis and the constant, unending growth of a big government left-wing liberalism. And keep in mind, by the way, a lot of conservatives today say, hey, we conservatives don't need to be anti-government, we don't need to be critical of big government. What is missed, however, and what was very well understood in the 1950s by Buckley and others involved at National Review, and indeed by traditionalist conservatives like Russell Kirk and Robert Nisbet, is that big government is not only an offense to free market economics. Big government, as it was built by the New Deal and as it continues to grow under the Great Society and other statist Democrats, is in fact also an attack upon the family. It's an attack upon civil society. It's an attack upon churches. Because what it is that government has no kind of social capital of its own. And all the functions that it takes over in terms of administering to people in their old age or sickness, all of these functions of government come at the expense of the church, the family, and other institutions of civil society. Government, in fact, starts to replace those other institutions. And this, of course, is exactly what we see at the height of welfare, where government is starting not only to provide what start out as being seen as benefits that are necessary to help widows and women who are just raising children on their own. And this is seen as being a merciful, compassionate thing. But of course, what it winds up doing is actually becoming an incentive for single motherhood. And so you start to see a massive decline in marriages and in the American family as a result of these perverse incentives and subsidies that are being set up by the welfare state and by this continual growth of the state replacing the family, the church, and other institutions of civil society. That's an important thing to keep in mind, and it's something that Bill Buckley was very keenly aware of throughout his life. The other great fight, of course, was the Cold War. Now, Buckley is, I think, very successful in fighting both of these sets of battles and in building a conservative movement that will be instrumental in winning these fights. That's not to say that Buckley did it on his own or that National Review did it on its own either. Rather, Buckley and National Review became points of contact for other conservatives. They helped to form the way conservatives were thinking, conservative politicians like Ronald Reagan, for example, and they helped to bring into contact lawyers and activists and others who otherwise might not have met one another, but who encountered one another at National Review events, or seeing one another's names in the letters pages of National Review, or seeing Bill Buckley speak as he did very prolifically on college campuses and in other venues. This actually was creating cadres. This was actually creating friendships and the social networks that you need in order to create a political movement. And so Buckley was instrumental in that through his sort of personal contacts with people and by the public face that he presented. And Buckley was a media sensation. He was, first of all, he was successful as a speaker on college campuses. He became, a best-selling author with God and Man at Yale. He became very well known as the publisher of National Review. Even though National Review's circulation was quite small at the outset, Buckley became known as one of the leading writers of American conservatism in the middle of the 20th century, and therefore his byline started to appear in a number of other publications as well. He was very much in demand, even by many publications in the center or on the left, as the person you go to as the representative of conservatism. In a way, Bill Buckley combined both almost Charlie Kirk-like approach to speaking on campuses and creating new organizations with a lot of intellectual heft and media success, like many of today's podcasters and sort of cutting-edge figures in conservative media. Buckley was all of that. Buckley was a one-man media revolution, as well as being, the driving force or organizing driving force of so much of the 20th century conservative movement. Now, how successful is Buckley? How much does his contribution really matter in both fighting statism at home and also defeating the Soviet Union abroad? Well, Buckley is initially very frustrated by Republican Party politics. The Republican Party of the 1950s comes to be dominated by President Eisenhower. Eisenhower is a conservative of a sort, but Eisenhower is not very ideological as a conservative. He's not someone who's very critical of the New Deal. He, in fact, is someone who wants to basically keep things as they are and prevent any kind of bad change. Now, Eisenhower is quite critical of what he calls at first the military-industrial congressional complex, which is basically Eisenhower is afraid that military contractors are going to continue getting so much money from Congress that it's going to completely distort America's economic system and turn us into something a little bit like the Soviet Union, right? So what's going to happen is that we're going to bankrupt ourselves by spending on the military, and that the military contractors, defense contractors get so much money that they then plow that money back into basically supporting congressional candidates and influencing their elections. And basically you wind up with a self-sustaining system where the government is taking taxpayer money or is going into debt. It's then using that to buy weapons, and the weapons manufacturers are then basically buying congressmen in order to keep the whole cycle going. This is why Eisenhower in his farewell address tackles what he calls the military-industrial complex. And Eisenhower decides at the last minute that calling it the military-industrial congressional complex might be seen as a little heavy-handed coming from a president who, wants to have good relations with Congress. Even though he's out on his way out the door, this is his farewell address, he still thinks it would be a little improper for the president to criticize Congress in quite such stark terms. Nevertheless, that's what his speech is laying out. Now, Buckley, on the other hand, and many conservatives at National Review think that it's good that we continue to spend a lot of money on defense because they say that we're going to need it in order to confront the Soviet Union, not only as deterrence, but also that we should be prepared to get actively involved in conflicts. And yet that's not to say that Buckley or the early National Review was always in favor of getting into wars. Quite the contrary. A number of thinkers at National Review, even when they were quite hawkish, saw that there were in fact limitations to things that we were doing in Korea, for example, or that once the Vietnam War gets started, even though conservatives at National Review are generally quite supportive of America's efforts against communism in the Vietnam War, there are voices which say that maybe this is not going to turn out so well. And there is a little bit of a hint that, in fact, conservatives will eventually have to turn in the 1970s away from a more active, sort of military-based approach to the Cold War and to fighting the Soviet Union to a more diplomatic and sort of big picture approach to it. So, on the one hand, you could say, well, National Review and Bill Buckley are not totally successful in the Cold War because their idea of rollback, their idea of directly confronting Soviet power is never adopted, certainly never adopted in full. But the flip side to that is that you have to weigh the influence that Buckley and National Review and the conservative movement that Buckley is building up, the influence that they have in changing some of the direction or emphasis of the overall policy of containment, which had been set up during the Truman years and which was inspired and really thought through by an intellectual by the name of George Kennan. Now, George Kennan was not involved with the conservative movement. He was, a lifelong Democrat. He was seen as someone that the conservative movement and Bill Buckley could be quite critical of. And yet Kennan today, if he were alive, and in fact he lives until the early 21st century, he lives to about 101 or 102, George Kennan would now be considered quite hard right. He was, an elitist, but an elitist meritocrat. He came from the Midwest. He never felt like he totally belonged among Ivy Leaguers, and yet he was a great believer in the highest standards of civilization. He hated vulgarity. He hated, the fact that America seemed to be a crass civilization, a very commercial civilization, and not one that put sort of nobility and statesmanship as its highest priorities. So Kennan had certain conservative characteristics, and in fact, towards the end of his life after the Cold War, he's even an advocate of the idea that America might be better off if it were more regional and if it, had still perhaps a union, but a union in which states and regions were playing a bigger part than the federal government. He was very skeptical of the way, America was going under the consolidated power of the federal government. So Kennan's a very interesting character, but throughout the Cold War, he is seen as being the villain by many conservatives at National Review and by Buckley and others, because Kennan is the architect of this policy of containment, which means that the United States will basically, prevent Western Europe from going communist. We will prevent the military expansion of communism into Western Europe and in other places. And we will, prevent the Soviet Union from trying to keep gaining a larger and larger empire. But we won't actually take active measures to destroy Soviet power in Eastern Europe. We will basically respect the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. This is something that is considered to be a moral sellout and strategically dangerous by conservatives. So why do I say that the influence of Buckley and other conservatives on containment policy is actually quite significant and winds up being one of the things that helps win the Cold War? Well, it's precisely because even though Kennan was a realist, Kennan didn't like to excessively moralize in foreign policy, but he certainly recognized that communism was an evil system. However, some of the technocrats who are in charge of U.S. defense policy and the State Department and otherwise are involved in actual Cold War policy implementation, they are softer on communism, or they don't like to speak in terms of ideals. They like to think that they will simply have clever schemes and plans that will foil the expansion of communism, whether in Europe or in the Third World or elsewhere. They have a very amoral approach to the Cold War. And that's, of course, the opposite of the approach taken by Bill Buckley and National Review and the conservative movement. Buckley is always very clear about the evil of the Soviet system, the evil of communism, how communism is oppressing not only the captive nations of Eastern Europe, but communism is also oppressing the Russian people themselves. This rhetoric, this approach, this moral condemnation of communism becomes a component of Ronald Reagan's speeches very early on. Reagan has the same view. It's not like he gets it from Buckley, but certainly having the conservative movement out there promoting this set of ideas about the evil of communism is extremely important in creating a groundwork of supporters for Ronald Reagan, first of all within the Republican Party, and then ultimately electing Ronald Reagan as president. And Reagan as president actually surprises Buckley. In fact, the very last book that William F. Buckley Jr. writes before he dies in 2008 is called The Reagan I Knew, and I highly recommend this book. It is a wonderful piece of writing by a man who, in fact, was aware, I think, that he was already dying. This is Bill Buckley writing his final book, looking back on what seems like his greatest triumph, the fact that he set the stage for Ronald Reagan, Reagan was elected, and Reagan helped to win the Cold War. And what's marvelous about this book is that Buckley has the maturity and the insight to look back and say he got Ronald Reagan wrong. Now, that might be a shocking thing to say, but Buckley thought that Reagan had a confrontational view with the Soviet Union, and that was the core of Reagan. And then when Reagan started to have negotiations with Gorbachev in the late 1980s, the premier of the Soviet Union, Buckley thought that this was something of a betrayal of conservatism. And in fact, in the pages of National Review, you can find numerous essays in the late 1980s that say Reagan is weakening, Reagan is selling out, Reagan is not being as tough on the Soviets as he needs to be. The magazine and Buckley didn't turn against Reagan completely, but they certainly thought that he wasn't delivering on the promise of being a firm, strong anti-communist. And what Buckley says in The Reagan I Knew is that he was wrong to think that Reagan was weakening, or that Reagan didn't know what he was doing in terms of his negotiations with Gorbachev. Reagan was not being hoodwinked by the Soviets. Reagan was, in fact, steering the Soviet Union to a peaceful collapse. And that Reagan, as Buckley comes to realize in this final book of his in 2008, Reagan was, in fact, a man who believed in peace, a man who believed in making sure that nuclear weapons became obsolete in superpower conflict, and that he engaged in this very vigorous diplomacy with the Soviet Union, with an enemy, in order to bring about a peaceful end to the Cold War, rather than simply having two armed camps that were both spending themselves into oblivion, going on forever. Now, it is important that Reagan, did increase defense spending. He did it with the Strategic Defense Initiative, the so-called Star Wars program. This involved some cutting-edge and sort of over-the-horizon technologies designed to place satellites, for example, that would be able to neutralize nuclear weapons, ICBMs, when they're fired by, hitting them with projectiles or hitting them with laser beams. This was very cutting-edge stuff, and it was very expensive. And there was a lot of feeling that perhaps, Reagan was betraying the principles of small government by spending so much on defense and on this SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. But in fact, because the Soviets feel like their, nuclear weapons are now going to be less advantageous to them, and because they feel like, first of all, they want to try to match Reagan's military buildup, they want to try spending more, but then they realize their economy is too weak to allow them to continue spending money on building new weapon systems. This is very demoralizing to the Soviets, and it leads the Soviets to realize, it leads Mikhail Gorbachev in particular to realize, that the Soviet Union simply cannot win the Cold War. It can't even compete effectively with the United States in the Cold War. So Reagan, through a combination both of spending and also of moral clarity, is actually able to employ a kind of magnified version of containment to shepherd the Soviet Union into its dissolution. And of course, in 1989, the year that Reagan leaves office as president, the Berlin Wall comes down. Now that leads to perhaps the final chapter, the extended final chapter of Bill Buckley's life, and how we should look at his success or failure. By the way, I should also point out, not only did Buckley succeed in laying the groundwork for Ronald Reagan and for his success in the Cold War, but of course Ronald Reagan would also be a president who would put an end to the so-called era of big government. And Bill Buckley and the conservative movement are successful in preventing the trend which had started with the New Deal in the 1930s, a trend which could have continued to see the New Deal, the Great Society, and then even further big government programs at home after the Great Society. The conservative movement is effective in stopping the further growth of massive new welfare state programs. Also, of course, the conservative movement that is built up by Buckley and by all the institutions that he either sets up himself or inspires is extremely successful when it comes to individual issues. So there are a lot of single-issue groups, there are a lot of omnibus organizations, think tanks, Heritage Foundation, and others that start to, go piece by piece, stopping left-wing initiatives. So think about the Second Amendment. Conservatives are very successful in getting concealed carry, getting defense of, Americans' right to keep and bear arms, the Second Amendment. Conservatives are successful in states across the country in getting laws changed to defend the right to keep and bear arms. Similarly, when it comes to the right to work, the conservative movement is extremely effective at repealing closed-shop union laws and creating conditions in which you can have a much more free labor market within the states, especially the southern states. This, by the way, is one of the things that winds up, in addition to foreign competition from Japan and then China, one of the things that actually causes the loss of jobs in Detroit, in Michigan and in the Rust Belt is precisely that the South adopts freer labor laws, and therefore a lot of industry, car manufacturing, for example, moves from the Rust Belt into the South. So that's something to keep in mind in terms of the effects that it has on later political movements and tendencies. So Buckley and the conservative movement are actually quite successful at home. Tax rates come down. Ronald Reagan is seen as being, someone who's very successful in a lot of these, areas. But of course, there are failures as well. Not just failures, but there are things which are already, or should perhaps already, in the late 20th century be recognized as growing problems, which are simply not effectively addressed by the conservative movement that has been built up by Bill Buckley. One of these will ultimately be immigration. Ronald Reagan tries to seek an immigration compromise where he will provide amnesty for illegal immigrants who've already come in, but in exchange he expects the Democratic Congress to tighten border security. Well, the amnesty happens, but the tightening of border security does not. And that sets up a situation in the 1990s where illegal immigration is a continuing problem, and there's a continuing expectation not only on the part of the left, but on the part of many Republicans, especially those who see mass immigration as beneficial for business. There's an expectation throughout the political class, throughout the establishment, which says that you're ultimately going to get an amnesty for any illegals who come in. And of course, if you are an illegal immigrant and you think you're ultimately going to get amnesty, that gives you a great incentive to arrive. You don't have a feeling that you have to get in line to get a green card or to get citizenship or to get permission to work, because you feel like, you can just skip the line, come in illegally, and sooner or later another Ronald Reagan will come around and pass an amnesty, or a Democrat will pass an amnesty. But one way or another, you and your family will be perfectly fine. And that creates, this tremendous incentive for more and more illegal immigration, which becomes a problem throughout the 1990s and the early 2000s. So you can say that the conservative movement did not sufficiently anticipate what was over the horizon in terms of a problem like that. You can also say that the effects of free trade, which, during the Cold War, free trade was often seen as being something that would strengthen America's alliances with other countries and help to check the influence of the Soviet Union. So we were happy to have free trade with Europe. We even, ultimately with Richard Nixon and then going onwards, started to have an economic relationship with communist China, so that communist China would feel bound to us by economic ties and would not be an ally for the Soviet Union, and that the fissures between the Soviet Union and communist China would then crack open wide, and this would strengthen America in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. Well, that happens, but then the problem, of course, is that after the Cold War, we continue to pursue free trade, even though we no longer have quite the same dependency or quite the same, utility with respect to allies that we had during the Cold War. There's also the question of what happens to an institution like NATO. The whole point of NATO was to stop Soviet expansion. The Soviet Union is not expanding anymore by the early 1990s because the Soviet Union ceases to exist in 1991. What happens to NATO? NATO doesn't go away. NATO instead expands. There is a fateful moment in 1990 and 1991 when the conservative movement really has to ask itself whether its approach, certainly to foreign policy, what it's going to be after the end of the Cold War and after the end of the Soviet Union, whether it's going to return to the principles that it had before the Cold War and before World War II, the principles of non-interventionism and staying out of foreign conflicts, or whether there will be a new mission adopted. It won't be a continuation of the old Cold War mission because the Soviet Union is gone. So if America is now going to have an internationalist and interventionist attitude towards the world and an internationalist, interventionist grand strategy, that grand strategy is going to have to be predicated on something other than fighting the Soviet Union. It's going to be something new, in other words, and not simply a conservation or a continuation of something that previously existed. That's something to keep in mind, in particular about NATO, which has to have a new mission and has to have a new identity after the end of the Cold War. Well, Buckley is open-minded about all of this. And in fact, by 1990, Buckley is 65 years old, and he's starting to step back from his role as leader of the conservative movement. He turns over the editorship of National Review to John O'Sullivan, who is a very important conservative. I can't say a lot about him right now. O'Sullivan's currently living in Hungary, where he leads the Danube Institute. And O'Sullivan was previously, before he became editor of National Review, a very close advisor to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom. So John O'Sullivan has always been someone who has looked at the kind of international scope that conservatism can have, trying to advance a defense of Western civilization on all fronts. But in any case, Bill Buckley is stepping back from his role as editor of National Review. John O'Sullivan actually welcomes a multiplicity of views about foreign policy in the pages of National Review. So even though O'Sullivan himself is very much committed to a conservative version of internationalism, there are people in the pages of National Review who are critical of the idea that we are going to get involved, for example, in fighting Iraq in 1991 in the Persian Gulf War, who are very critical of the expansion of NATO in some cases. Those voices are in a minority, but they're not completely absent from the pages of National Review. National Review not only was not trying to purge those voices, but in fact, under John O'Sullivan, who had been chosen, handpicked by Bill Buckley, National Review was trying to feature some of them. And National Review took seriously the arguments that Pat Buchanan made in the 1992 Republican primaries. Pat Buchanan was arguing for an America that should come home, that should not be involved in foreign conflicts. Buchanan was also very critical of mass immigration, and he was critical of free trade. National Review actually endorses Pat Buchanan in the New Hampshire primary of 1992. Now, this is despite the fact that Bill Buckley has been critical of Buchanan the year before, in 1990, for some of Buchanan's remarks about the interest groups that are interested in supporting America fighting Saddam Hussein in Kuwait and the Persian Gulf War of 1991 that ultimately happens. Buchanan controversially says that the only people who want to see America get involved in a war in the Middle East are the Israeli Defense Ministry and its Amen Corner in Congress. And then Buchanan goes on to name a number of Jewish intellectuals, some of them neoconservatives, as people who are warmongers and are pushing for American intervention in the Middle East. He names the syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. He names Richard Pearl, a defense policy intellectual. He mentions Henry Kissinger, who is an old enemy of Pat Buchanan's, going back to their service, their days in the Nixon administration together. And he also mentions A.M. Rosenthal, who is a opinion writer at the New York Times. And then Pat Buchanan says that if there is a war, it's going to be fought by people with names like, O'Sullivan and Leroy Brown and Gonzalez. So there are accusations leveled against Buchanan by writers for the neoconservative magazine Commentary, by its editor Norman Podhoretz and others, who say that Buchanan, in focusing on the fact that some prominent Jewish individuals are supporting the Persian Gulf War, and that the U.S. military consists of generally speaking Gentiles and doesn't have a high proportion of Jewish enlistees. They say, well, Buchanan is highlighting these points in order to make an anti-Semitic argument. He's basically saying, using anti-Semitic tropes in order to advance his anti-war views. Buckley takes this very seriously. Buckley writes an essay at the end of 1991 called In Search of Anti-Semitism, in which he addresses Buchanan's language, and he also looks at controversies involving one of his friends and colleagues at National Review, Joseph Sobran. Now, retrospectively, there is a kind of historical false memory about what it is that Buckley decides about Pat Buchanan. And you'll see a number of people who, in the 21st century, don't like Pat Buchanan, don't like his foreign policy, don't like his style of conservatism at all, and think that the Donald Trump administration is too much like the ideas that Pat Buchanan promoted in the 1990s. People who will say, well, William F. Buckley Jr., he read Pat Buchanan out of the conservative movement. He denounced him as an anti-Semite, and you should never have a resurgence of Buchananism in American conservatism because that is very much against the tradition that Buckley had set up on the right. But actually, what Buckley says in the book In Search of Anti-Semitism is that he can't defend Pat Buchanan's language against accusations of anti-Semitism when it comes to the specific things he says. But then he goes on, Buckley says, to acquit Pat Buchanan of being an anti-Semite himself. He says that, in fact, Buchanan has a pugnacious, contrarian temperament, but he is not, in fact, personally anti-Semitic. He doesn't hate Jews. And this is something that many Jewish friends of Pat Buchanan certainly agree with. They say they've never seen him have any kind of uncharitable attitude towards his friends or towards Jews in general. But of course, there's a question of the kind of rhetoric that he's used in criticizing the Persian Gulf War, in criticizing American intervention in the Middle East. So Buckley actually tries to create a compromise. He's very sensitive to the fact that Buckley has many Jewish friends, including some of the people that Buchanan's been directly sparring with, like Norman Podhoretz and A.M. Rosenthal. And Buckley is very sensitive to the fact that there are many Jews that he knows in New York and elsewhere who are greatly hurt by Buchanan's rhetoric and who see that there is a danger that anti-Semitic rhetoric is going to start gaining purchase on the American right. And, who knows if it starts, gaining purchase, where it's going to end. Will it continue, and get more and more flagrant and be applied to more and more questions? So there is a genuine concern on the part of many of Buckley's Jewish friends about anti-Semitism, and Buckley takes their concerns very seriously. But Buckley also feels a certain sense of sympathy with Pat Buchanan because they're both conservatives, and he feels a very close sympathy because he's very close friends with Joe Sobran. So Buckley is actually not looking to excommunicate anyone as if he were the Pope of American conservatism. He's not looking to purge anyone. He's instead trying to create a compromise where Pat Buchanan and Joe Sobran and others will no longer use the kind of rhetoric they've used about questions involving Israel and the supporters of American Israel in the United States itself. And Buckley is totally unsuccessful in this, by the way. So Pat Buchanan feels gravely offended, with certain reason, by Bill Buckley. He believes that, Buckley has, they haven't been close friends, but they've been colleagues in the conservative cause for a very long time. Buchanan actually looked up to Buckley as an older conservative who had been very successful in blazing a trail for people like Pat Buchanan himself as a syndicated columnist and as a media figure. In many ways, Buchanan is actually a kind of second coming of Bill Buckley in terms of the role that Buchanan has in the media in the early 1990s. So just as Bill Buckley is a conservative who becomes very famous as a writer, as a magazine editor, as a syndicated columnist, and ultimately for creating a television show called Firing Line, which Buckley hosts for decades, and which is a very kind of smart debate show where Buckley often talks to guests who are coming from the left and has a civilized discussion with them. Well, so too, Pat Buchanan becomes an extremely popular syndicated columnist in the early 1990s. He is a mainstay of cable news, and Buchanan is one of the original hosts of Crossfire on CNN, which is a tremendous success. So Buchanan, like Buckley, is a tremendous force for a conservative media revolution that's already happening in the early 1990s. And then Buchanan goes on to found a magazine, the American Conservative magazine, in the early 2000s, and he becomes a best-selling author. So there are a lot of parallels between Buchanan and Buckley. And in the early 1990s, Buchanan looked up with a certain amount of admiration to Bill Buckley. And that here he finds Bill Buckley denouncing his words as being anti-Semitic words, even if Buchanan himself is not anti-Semitic in his heart. Buchanan thinks that is, a betrayal, and that Buckley is siding with neoconservatives who not only, are making accusations against Buchanan, impugning his integrity, impugning his honesty, calling him an anti-Semite, but who are also, of course, very much against Buchanan's actual policy views, including those on American intervention in the Middle East and elsewhere abroad. So Bill Buckley comes to be seen by a lot of Pat Buchanan's friends and defenders. Buckley comes to be seen as someone who is opening the floodgates to a more foreign interventionist post-war conservatism that in fact is going to be guided not by someone like Buckley, but that's going to be guided by neoconservatives at magazines like Commentary and later at the Weekly Standard. The direction that conservatism institutionally and as a movement takes, beginning in the 1990s and on into the George W. Bush years, is indeed one that's defined not by either Bill Buckley's own original America First views in the early, before World War II, and that also isn't defined by Pat Buchanan's criticisms in the 1990s of foreign interventionism, but instead you have a new view which says that America should almost trade places with the old Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was trying to export communist revolution around the entire world. There are a number of influential people in the Republican Party and in the conservative movement, some of them aligned with the neoconservatives, who are arguing that America is going to be a revolutionary power in the 21st century, and that this is a good thing, that we should promote democratic revolutions around the world, and that we should use American military power to overthrow those, tyrannical governments that are preventing people from, overthrowing those governments and creating liberal democracies in the Middle East and in Latin America and throughout the entire planet. This is very much a moment of tremendous exuberance on the part of Americans in the political establishment in both parties who believe that America has this destiny to revolutionize the entire planet, and that we have the power to do so because the only superpower competitor we had in the 1980s, the Soviet Union, is now gone. Therefore, this is the American moment. We are now the American. The supreme power, the hegemonic power around the entire world, the indispensable nation, and therefore we can use our power to promote our values and Americanize the entire planet. This, by the way, is not only a vision that many interventionist, internationalist conservatives wind up adopting, globalist conservatives, you could even say. But it's also a view that the left winds up adopting, because the left says, well, we can also use America as a revolutionary force to promote the kind of revolutionary changes in morality that we want to see all around the world. And that's ultimately going to include, things like gay rights and transgender rights and so forth. So the left sees a very active American foreign policy after the Cold War as being a way to promote left-wing values all around the planet. Now, this is very different from what had been the case during the Cold War. During the Cold War, progressives and leftists were generally, they thought America shouldn't really be preventing the spread of socialism or even, perhaps even communism all around the world, and it was bad for America to be involved in this kind of war of ideas, in some cases, actual, hot wars around the world as part of, the effort to check the influence of the Soviet Union. Well, after the Cold War, that changes, and progressives now become very much in favor of a liberal internationalism in order to promote left-wing ideas all around the planet. And conservatives, those who are sort of hawkish interventionists and want to be involved in conflicts around the world, conservatives see themselves as promoting American values too. But of course, there is this great question then as to whether are you promoting American values or left-wing values with these, interventions abroad. And the way it winds up, working out is that because both people on the sort of Bill Clinton left and people on the George Bush right both want to see America involved in a number of conflicts around the world to promote American values, even if they disagree somewhat on what those values are. The interventions happen, and you actually get kind of both sets of values being promoted. And these interventions are then unsuccessful. They don't actually lead to the creation of liberal democracies around the world. Instead, they get the United States embroiled in conflicts that last for decades. And that's true of the Iraq War. It's true of the 20 years that we're in Afghanistan. We successfully defeat the Taliban, the Islamists running the country, when we invade in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks. But then 20 years later, when Joe Biden pulls us out of Afghanistan, the Taliban immediately retake power there. So we had 20 years, basically, we spent trillions of dollars, and yet we did not actually succeed in changing the fundamental political nature of Afghanistan, in instilling liberalism and democracy. So a lot of Pat Buchanan's criticisms turn out to be, the criticisms he was making in the early 1990s, in 1990 and 1991, turn out to be entirely correct. Now, Bill Buckley himself comes to believe this. And Bill Buckley, although he's initially quite hopeful about what might be achieved during the 2003 Iraq War, and he does want to believe the Bush administration when George W. Bush says that Iraq is working on weapons of mass destruction and America has to take a role in preventing Iraq from acquiring those weapons, Buckley buys into that for a short time. But then after a year or two, actually fairly early on as these things go, Buckley starts to write critical columns about the Iraq War, and it becomes clear that Buckley is in fact not on board with George W. Bush's version of a conservative or neoconservative mission in the world, and that Buckley actually continues to see he's not an isolationist. He's not someone who perhaps would get America completely out of all of our engagements around the world in the Middle East and in NATO and elsewhere. But Buckley is someone who had that origin as someone who wanted to keep us out of the Second World War, someone who was an America firster in the 1930s and 40s, early 40s. And so he comes to have this view that we need to strike a balance, certainly. We need to not be completely the opposite of the old America first view. We can't have America engaged in military conflicts all around the world, and we can't expect that we're going to use military force to democratize and liberalize a region like the Middle East. So Buckley, you could say, does a perfect circle and winds up returning, at least partly, to some of the views that he had early on. And I want to emphasize again that, Buckley should be viewed as someone who succeeded, just as the conservative movement he built succeeded, in winning the battles that were most important to him during his, the heyday of his lifetime, during the 20th century. And those were the battles against the Soviet Union and its version of communism, and the battle against, the increase of statism, not just the New Deal itself, but the idea that the New Deal was a stepping stone to ever greater degrees of government, intervention in family life and government intervention in Americans, lives in every respect, in the economy and so forth. The conservative movement, established by Buckley and led by Buckley, succeeds in, seeing the Soviet Union collapse, and succeeds in seeing the confidence that Americans had in ever greater government also be refuted, and the end of a sequence of New Deals and great societies. So in those regards, Buckley is a tremendous success. Buckley should also not be viewed simply as someone who acted as a gatekeeper or as, what we would now call a kind of cancel culture, activist, someone who was constantly concerned about purging the American right. On the contrary, Buckley usually tried to strike compromises. And the exceptions, such as when he banished, the John Birch Society, are quite distinct from other episodes where he really did try to bring together different sets of conservative thinkers and polemicists who had different views and who even saw, perhaps a great deal of personal malice in one another. Buckley always tried to keep friends together. And in fact, that was kind of the origin of National Review itself, that when Buckley founded National Review in 1955, he tried to bring together a variety of thinkers who didn't all share necessarily exactly the same principles and who often had personalities that clashed with one another. So the early National Review included traditionalists, it included libertarians, it included cold warriors who thought that both the libertarians and the traditionalists were too idealistic and not nearly, sort of muscle-minded enough or anti-communist enough. Buckley brought those different threads of the conservative movement together and wove them into a common garment, a common movement. That, I think, is the lesson that people should take from Bill Buckley, not a lesson of purges and a lesson of trying to find fault with your friends and allies and trying to exclude them whenever possible because you think that that they are adopting principles that are completely antithetical to your own. Buckley was always trying to bring conservatives together. And that doesn't mean that he didn't, set down some firm lines, but it does mean that he tried to, attempt every form of reconciliation first before going to the point of saying that there simply can be no communication between one side and another. So Buckley should be looked at not as someone who is irrelevant to the 21st century, but rather as someone whose successes in the 20th century can't be simply duplicated in the 21st because our circumstances are so different, but rather that his successes in the 20th century show how we could approach the issues that are most important to us in the 21st century, whether it's immigration, whether it's making sure that we don't get involved in endless wars, whether it's changing the way we approach the economy to make sure that we are defending the American middle class against Chinese communist efforts at global integration that are ultimately going to be bad for American industry and American workers. We can approach these kinds of controversies, these kinds of issues, taking certain inspiration from Bill Buckley, not because he had the same view of those issues, because it was a completely different environment in the late 20th century, but rather because the way that he approached the issues on which the conservatives did succeed and that were most important in the late 20th century, we too can approach the issues that are most important in our time in a very parallel fashion.